For nearly a quarter of a century, a silent dread stalked the lonely roads and windswept cliffs of southwestern Scotland. Travelers vanished without explanation. Horses galloped home without riders. Torn clothing and blood-slicked saddles were found along the coastal paths, yet no bandits were caught, no justice served. This was not random violence. It was a pattern of calculated, repetitive horror. And behind it all was a name that would eventually become synonymous with terror: Sawney Bean. This is not a legend meant to spook children or entertain late-night campfires. It is a tale deeply woven into the bones of Scottish folklore, supported by unnerving details and real historical fears. At the heart of this narrative lies a single monstrous family, cut off from society, who turned to murder, incest, and cannibalism not for survival, but as a way of life. For 25 years, the Bean clan terrorized the Scottish countryside from their subterranean lair, leaving behind no witnesses and only fragments of flesh as clues. The land they haunted was already harsh. Scotland in the 15th and 16th centuries was no stranger to violence, clan warfare, or famine. But even among the blood-stained chronicles of the time, the Bean clan stands out not only for the scale of their crimes, but for the methodical depravity with which they operated. This was not the work of madmen in a frenzy. It was cold, structured, generational. It was human evil in its purest form. The origins of this nightmare began not with a massacre, but with a man born into mediocrity and bitterness. Alexander Bean, known to history as Sawney, was born in East Lothian, most likely in the late 1400s or early 1500s. Accounts vary on exact dates, as much of his life has blurred into the realm of folklore. But what most versions agree on is that he came from humble, possibly resentful beginnings. His father was said to be a ditch digger or hedge trimmer, professions common in a rural, laboring class. But Sawney had no interest in honest work. From a young age, he was described as sullen, violent, and cunning. He grew into a man who scoffed at structure and morality, convinced that society owed him more than it ever offered. He eventually fled his village with a woman whose name has been lost to history, but whose reputation was every bit as dark as his. Some say she was accused of witchcraft. Others claim she had already been involved in murders before ever meeting Sawney. What is certain is that together they became something far worse than either could have alone. They journeyed westward and disappeared from the world of men, seeking isolation in the treacherous coastlines of Galloway. There, hidden among the jagged cliffs and crashing waves, they found Benane Head, a vast sea cave with a narrow tidal entrance. Accessible only at low tide, the cave stretched over 200 meters into solid rock, damp, pitch black, and shielded from civilization. It became their sanctuary and their slaughterhouse. At first, they likely lived as scavengers, stealing what they could from roadsides or isolated cottages. But stealing left witnesses. And so they escalated to ambush, to murder, and finally to the unthinkable. They began eating their victims, not out of starvation, but because it was easier to destroy all evidence that way. No bodies, no questions, only silence. Their gruesome lifestyle evolved into a family tradition. Over the next several decades, the pair produced children, some say as many as 14 sons and daughters. In complete isolation, without contact from the outside world, those children grew up to know only darkness, violence, and cannibalism. And as they matured, they coupled with each other, forming a grotesque family tree of incestuous offspring who knew no other form of life. By the time of their capture, the Bean clan allegedly numbered 45 people born, raised, and bloodied in that foul cave. Each night, they would emerge under the cover of darkness to patrol the nearby roads. Using stealth and numbers, they ambushed lone travelers or small groups, dragging them screaming into the rocks. Once inside the cave, the victims were butchered like livestock, their flesh salted or pickled for preservation. Limbs were hung from hooks on the walls, torsos hacked to pieces, bones discarded or left to rot in heaps. Over time, the cave became more than a shelter. It was a mausoleum of horror, a factory of death. And yet, they remained undetected. As years passed, rumors spread of hauntings, of ghouls in the cliffs, of disappearing coaches and riders who vanished into mist. Entire caravans were found ransacked, with no trace of attackers. But no one suspected the truth, that the killers were not spirits, but people flesh and blood as mortal as their victims, yet monstrously deviant. The disappearances grew so frequent that inns refused to rent rooms to unfamiliar travelers without armed escort. Locals accused one another, and several innocent innkeepers were executed for suspected involvement in the missing persons plague. Yet the killings continued, uninterrupted and unexplained. The authorities were powerless. Without evidence or suspects, they could do little but watch as their people vanished. The king himself, James VI, became aware of the problem and demanded reports. But even the royal investigators were stymied. The Bean clan, hidden beneath the very soil of the kingdom, had achieved something almost unthinkable. They had erased themselves from the awareness of society while continuing to feed on it every night. And then in the 25th year, they made a mistake. It was supposed to be another ordinary ambush. A man and his wife, returning from a local fair, were spotted riding near Ballantrae under the cover of dusk. The clan struck. The woman was pulled from her horse, screaming as hands tore at her cloak. But the man fought back. Armed and furious, he drew his sword and slashed wildly. Blood flew. One of the attackers fell. The others hesitated long enough for him to remount and escape. He fled to the nearest village, bloodied and raving. Local men listened in stunned horror. They sent riders to Edinburgh. For the first time, there was a credible witness, someone who had seen the monsters and lived. The king responded with fury. He gathered an armed search party numbering over 400 men, including trackers, soldiers, and bloodhounds. They rode into Galloway and began their hunt, sweeping the coastal paths, probing every crevice. And when the hounds began howling at Benane Head, they followed. What they would find inside that cave would shock a nation and earn the Beans their place in history, not as men, women, or children, but as beasts. The soldiers lit torches and pressed into the cave's throat, the wet stones swallowing their footsteps and voices. What they saw as the flames licked across the walls nearly brought grown men to their knees. Human bones piled high in corners like firewood, snapped and split, scraped clean. Torsos hung like meat in a slaughterhouse. Skulls rested on shelves, grinning silently. The air was thick with the stench of rotting flesh and human waste. A sickening stew bubbled in a corner cauldron, with a dismembered arm still floating near the surface. And then, there were the people, if they could be called that. Pale, sun-starved creatures, crouched low in filth, their faces contorted in snarls, baring teeth like animals. They didn't speak. They hissed. It was not just the horror of what the soldiers found that shook them, it was the sheer number. Over 40 members of the Bean clan were pulled from that cavern. Men, women, children, some adults so malformed by incest that they resembled beasts more than humans. The women clutched babies to their chests, while older children shrieked and thrashed at the soldiers like feral cats. They had never known the sun, never heard a church bell, never seen a book. The only lessons they had ever learned were how to kill and how to carve a body. The soldiers did not ask questions. They dragged every last one of them outbound, chained, gagged when necessary, and began the long journey back across the country, bearing with them the living embodiment of nightmare. When they arrived in Edinburgh, the entire city turned to witness the procession. Crowds lined the streets in horrified awe. Mothers covered their children's eyes. Priests wept openly. The Beans were paraded like demons through cobblestone lanes. Some of the spectators were widows and fathers of the clan's victims. Others came simply to stare at the grotesque fruits of absolute depravity. King James VI himself was present when the sentence was passed. There would be no trial, no mercy, no appeals. This was not a case of crime and punishment. It was a ritual cleansing of a spiritual disease. The male members of the clan were executed first. Their arms and legs were hacked off and left to bleed slowly. Their genitals were crushed. Their throats were slit last. None were allowed the dignity of a quick death. They died shrieking. The women watched it all. Then they were tied to stakes and burned alive. Their children cast screaming into the flames with them. The fires at Leith burned for 2 days. The city reeked of scorched flesh and vengeance. By the end of it, the Bean bloodline was erased from the earth in its entirety. No one wept. No one questioned it. If anything, people cheered. It was not justice. It was purgation. And yet, as thorough as the purge had been, the memory could not be buried so easily. In the weeks that followed, The cave was sealed and declared cursed. Locals avoided the area, claiming that cries could still be heard echoing through the stone at night. Sea winds carried the scent of smoke and blood. Fishermen refused to drop anchor near Benan Head. The government made efforts to erase the event from official records, embarrassed, perhaps, that such a horror had festered unchecked for so long. But the people remembered. Oral histories flourished. Ballads were written, and the name Sawney Bean became shorthand for evil incarnate. Stories of the Bean clan soon spread beyond Scotland, becoming part of British folklore and later Victorian horror fiction. But the original tale, with all its raw brutality and historical detail, remained etched in the soil of Galloway. The mystery, however, didn't end there. Skeptics have since questioned the factual basis of the story. Could an entire family of 45 people live undetected for over 2 decades? Could so many disappearances go unnoticed without real investigation? Some scholars suggest the tale was political propaganda, perhaps, invented to demonize the Scots during a time of English tension. Others argue that the story was exaggerated, that there may have been a small group of bandits operating in the area, their story later embellished by fear, myth, and time. But even if certain details were distorted or fictionalized, something real rooted this legend. The fear was genuine. The disappearances were documented. And the cave at Benan Head still exists, still cold, still silent, still watching. What lingers more than anything is the question that can never be fully answered. How does a human mind, let alone an entire family, fall so deep into depravity that it no longer sees others as people, but as livestock? How does a society allow such evil to thrive at its borders for decades, unseen and unanswered? Perhaps the truth is this: the Bean clan is not merely a historical anomaly. They are a reflection of what festers when humanity is abandoned, when law fails, when the wilderness reclaims the soul. And perhaps, buried beneath the soil, there are still others who vanish not because of ghosts, but because monsters, like the Beans, know how to hide. The fires had died out, but the horror they tried to purge lingered. In the months following the execution of the Bean clan, Scotland found itself in a state of uneasy reflection. The caves were left undisturbed. The government made no effort to explore further. No academic study was ordered, and no religious rites were held to cleanse the site. The prevailing mood was one of collective denial, a silent agreement that the less said, the better. The people wanted to move on, but the earth itself seemed unwilling to forget. Rain fell harder on Benan Head. The winds howled longer, and those who dared to come close swore they still heard cries, not of vengeance, but of hunger. The wider implications of the Bean case ran deep. It forced a nation to reckon with its own ignorance. For 2 decades, a monstrous cult had thrived just beyond the edge of civilization. It had grown not in a foreign land, but within Scotland's own breast. The embarrassment reached even the royal court. Though King James VI had swiftly eliminated the threat, the knowledge that such savagery had flourished unnoticed during his rule weighed heavily. Some say it fueled his later obsession with order, discipline, and the supernatural. The very next year, he authored Demonology, a treatise on witchcraft and demonic influence, perhaps in part to rationalize the Bean family's inhumanity. They were not merely criminals, he suggested, but something else entirely, something unclean, demonic. But there were others who saw the Beans not as demons, but as a failure of human systems. The remote nature of Benan Head, the indifference of feudal lords to rural suffering, and the sparse rule of law in Galloway all contributed to the conditions that allowed a killer to become a patriarch. If Sawney Bean had been executed for theft or jailed for vagrancy early in life, could this horror have been avoided? Or was he always destined for darkness? No clear answers emerged. What remained were stories. Terrible stories. The survivors of the victims, those who had lost fathers, daughters, brothers, found no comfort in the executions. Closure, if it came at all, was poisoned by the knowledge that their loved ones had not simply been killed, but consumed. Many families relocated, their grief too great to bear in a land that had once protected monsters. Churches quietly began incorporating prayers for the lost and unnamed, for those who wandered into shadow and never returned. New roads were built to bypass the Galloway coast entirely, as though to avoid the very memory of what had happened there. But even as the nation tried to forget, The myth of the beans took on a life of its own. Tales spread through taverns and marketplaces. Parents used the name Sawney Bean to discipline unruly children. Eat your supper or the beans will come for you. Some added flourishes to the tale, that the family had made altars from bones, that they had written in blood on the cave walls, that they worshipped pagan gods by the light of dripping candles. The real horror, though, needed no embellishment. A family, isolated by geography and circumstance, had chosen to abandon every human instinct except the desire to consume. There were darker rumors, still rumors, that some members of the clan had escaped, that during the chaos of the royal raid, one or two had fled into the rocks and vanished, that a child, too young to understand death, had slipped into the sea and swum to safety. These whispers persisted for decades. Every so often a traveler would go missing near Ayrshire, or a mutilated corpse would wash ashore, and people would mutter that the beans were back. No evidence ever surfaced, but the fear endured. It always does when the monster is human. The legend began to evolve as it crossed borders. In England, Sawney Bean was invoked during times of anti-Scottish sentiment, his story used as a symbol of Scottish savagery. Plays were written. Ballads were sung. By the 18th century, traveling puppet shows and penny dreadfuls featured Sawney Bean as a sort of cannibal bogeyman. Over time, the tale lost some of its grim realism and became part of Gothic horror. But in Scotland, especially in the villages near Benane Head, the story never softened. It was not a tale. It was a scar. Folk historians tried to trace the oral versions of the story back to early pamphlets and local testimony. Some skeptics insisted that the entire narrative was fabricated an 18th century English invention meant to smear the Scots, born out of political propaganda during the Jacobite unrest. But these arguments ignored the earliest fragments of the tale, which predated the printed versions by generations. The disappearances were real. That much was undeniable. Whether the beans killed hundreds or merely dozens, whether they practiced cannibalism out of ritual or convenience, what mattered was this: people had vanished. A cave was filled with bones. A clan had lived apart from the world and thrived on its flesh. The psychological horror of the Bean saga proved as enduring as its historical questions. Here was not a lone killer like Gilles de Rais or Elizabeth Bathory, twisted by nobility or warfare. Sawney Bean was a man of the dirt, a product of poverty, an echo of primal hunger. He didn't kill for pleasure. He built a life on killing. He raised children who had never known another world. They didn't grow up corrupted, they were born into corruption, baptized in blood. This was not a descent into madness. It was a culture, a micro-society, an inverted kingdom beneath the rocks. And that is what frightened people most. The idea that savagery didn't just dwell in dark corners but could thrive there, multiply, breed, and return to the surface. The deeper one studies the legacy of Sawney Bean. The more unsettling it becomes, not simply because of the murders, the cannibalism, or the incestuous lineage, but because of what it reveals about human thresholds. What conditions must exist for a man to abandon every structure of morality, to not only commit evil but to build an entire family around it? Sawney Bean did not just kill, he created. He designed a self-sustaining organism of violence, a multi-generational community engineered for murder. And for 25 years, it worked. It thrived in the darkness, while the world above tried to convince itself such darkness did not exist. There are no surviving records from the Bean clan themselves. No letters, no inscriptions. They had no written language. Their history was oral, functional, tribal. And what little can be known about their lives in the cave comes from the soldiers who dragged them into the light, and from the folklore that exploded in their wake. But those fragments paint a picture far worse than any horror story. Children born underground, never named. Boys taught to butcher before they could speak properly. Girls raped by their own brothers, their own fathers, to continue the line. Rituals of dismemberment repeated until they became routine. Flesh roasted over flame or soaked in brine for the leaner months. Trophies taken not out of pride, but for inventory. Leather pouches filled with fingers. Skulls stripped and used as bowls. They lived not as people, but as predators that had unlearned civilization. And yet, they were still recognizably human. They bled. They screamed. They clung to each other as the flames rose. They had names for one another, gestures of affection. That, perhaps, is the final horror, that they were not monsters, not demons, not possessed by any force but themselves. Their violence was not the product of madness or illness. It was deliberate, taught, inherited. Some accounts from the execution describe one of the older sons cursing the crowd as he died. He allegedly shouted that it was the world's cruelty that had shaped them, that they had been exiled and left with no choice. But the bodies hanging in the cave told another story. The careful preservation of limbs, the sheer efficiency of the operation, the patterns of abduction, they told a story of selection, not desperation. This was not random rage. This was a family business. After the executions, King James ordered that no member of the Bean family be buried in sacred ground. Their ashes were scattered, their bones crushed. Any trace of them was to be erased. But even kings cannot purge memory. For centuries afterward, whispers of the Beans continued to circulate in the Scottish oral tradition. Parents still warned their children not to stray too close to the sea caves. Farmhands working late along the coast would feel watched from the bluffs. Superstition turned to ritual. Churches held annual sermons for the unfound dead. Occasionally, someone would claim to hear a child's cry echo from the sealed cave mouth. No one investigated. No one wanted to. The Benane Head Cave was eventually declared unsafe. Its entrance was partially collapsed by landslides. Whether by accident or quiet human intervention remains unknown. It became a place few dared approach. But it was never forgotten. In the 18th and 19th centuries, writers and antiquarians began collecting the tales of the Beans and publishing them in chapbooks and broadsides. Each retelling grew more elaborate. In some versions, Sawney had 50 children, or even 70. Others added a black altar of sacrifice at the heart of the cave. A few made him a giant. But the bones, when they were first uncovered, had been human. In 1843, a team of amateur historians visited the remains of the cave, hoping to study it for a travelogue on Scottish folklore. Though the bones had long since been cleared, the visitors reported finding deep gouges in the cave wall's claw-like marks, made not by erosion but by fingernails, as if some victims had been held there, alive, trying to escape. One woman in the group fainted. The story was buried in the back pages of a local journal, but it reignited public interest. The story of Sawney Bean once again began to crawl back into the cultural bloodstream. Throughout the 20th century, his name appeared in countless retellings books, radio plays, documentaries. Horror filmmakers borrowed liberally from the legend. Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes was a direct spiritual descendant of the Sawney Bean tale, an isolated cannibalistic family preying on travelers in a barren landscape. Others drew from it less overtly, but no less clearly. The concept of a tribe of humans reverting to savagery, rejecting morality and language and compassion in favor of flesh and survival, can be traced back again and again to that dripping cave in Scotland. But none of these adaptations could fully capture the stark, brutal reality of the original story. Because while monsters in film often lurk behind masks or mutant deformities, the Beans wore only their own faces. They were born as men and women. They simply chose not to remain so. And when they did, the world above distracted, ignorant, and afraid looked away. There is something uniquely terrifying about the idea that such a clan could form not in ancient times or some post-apocalyptic future, but in the early modern age, within the reach of a throne, in a kingdom with roads and towns and kings. It wasn't the wilderness that created the Beansit. It was the gaps between civilization, the blind spots where law could not reach. And so they thrived, invisible until their hunger made them reckless. In that failure lies the true meaning of the story. The caution is not about cannibalism or caves or curses. It is about neglect, about what festers when no one is looking, about what grows when the powerful do not care to see. In the centuries that followed the eradication of the Bean clan, Scotland changed. Roads were paved where once there were only muddy paths. The rule of law extended farther into the highlands and coasts, and the influence of the monarchy slowly yielded to emerging forms of civic governance. But even as the country grew more civilized on the surface, the story of Sawney Bean remained embedded deep in its cultural memory, raw, visceral, unforgotten. Unlike the polished tales of knights and monarchs that adorned the history books, the tale of the Beans was passed in whispers, half warnings, half confessionals, carrying the weight of something too real to dismiss entirely, and too shameful to embrace fully. Fishermen along the Ayrshire coast still avoided the cave, even into the 1900s, their fathers having warned them of the place that ate people. Tourists came in trickles, drawn by the morbid curiosity that always follows old evil, but locals never lingered. They claimed the tides near Benane Head sounded different, more like screaming than waves. Some brought flowers, others brought salt. One woman in 1936 nailed a crucifix to the rocks above the cave entrance and swore she heard weeping inside when she did. She never returned. The crucifix, weathered and split, still hung there decades later. But as the legend lived on, it began to mutate. In urban Scotland, particularly in Glasgow and Edinburgh, the name Sawney Bean became shorthand for uncivilized brutality. English tabloids during periods of tension with Scotland would revive the story as a grotesque caricature, portraying Scots as barbarous and backward. The name Sawney itself became a pejorative in some English circles, a slur tied to fear and ridicule. This angered many Scottish intellectuals, who argued that the tale had been co-opted and weaponized. In the mid-20th century, a new kind of historian emerged who challenged the very reality of the Bean saga altogether. These skeptics pointed to the lack of official court documents or execution records from the period. They noted that much of the written material came decades, even centuries, after the events supposedly took place. They argued that the entire story may have been an elaborate piece of anti-Scottish propaganda crafted by English writers during the Jacobite Rising, some monstrous fable invented to paint Highlanders as savages, unfit for rule. Some went further, suggesting the Beans never existed at all. But their arguments, however rational on the surface, failed to extinguish the deeper resonance of the tale. Because even if the story had been embroidered, even if it had been distorted by centuries of retelling, it had roots. Real people did vanish along the Galloway coast in the 15th and 16th centuries. Official correspondence from the time notes growing concern over unresolved disappearances. Merchants refused to travel the western routes without escort. Several families were reportedly executed on suspicion of harboring outlaws. And the cave at Benane Head, deep, defensible, impossible to spot at high tide, remained very real, too perfect a lair for coincidence. And there was something else the skeptics could never explain away: the emotional memory. In Galloway and the surrounding shires, the story wasn't told with theatrical flair or journalistic detachment. It was spoken like history, dark, ugly history passed down through generations, not as entertainment, but as caution. Grandparents didn't recite it to amuse. They told it to warn. Stay close to home. Don't travel alone. Evil grows in forgotten places. As the modern world advanced, turning folklore into tourism and horror into pop culture, Sawney Bean reappeared in other forms. In 2005, a small independent film was made in Scotland based loosely on the legend, depicting a modern-day hiker stumbling across a family of cave-dwelling cannibals. In 2011, a stage play reimagined the story through the eyes of one of the daughters, grappling with her blood-stained legacy. And in countless horror films, from Wrong Turn to The Descent, the influence of the Bean myth is undeniable. The isolated family, the deviant bloodline, the cave. But in these retellings, something is always lost, because the real terror of the Bean story is not in the blood or the gore or even the cannibalism. It is in the time it lasted, 25 years. That is what lodges in the chest like a splinter. 25 years of slaughter. A generation of vanishing lives, of mothers never knowing what happened to their sons, of children growing up with a name and then disappearing forever into the dark. The horror wasn't just that people died, it was that no one stopped it, that no one even knew it was happening. Even today, in the age of satellites and search engines, the fear that something might be lurking just outside the reach of our vision still grips us, that somewhere in the cracks of society, something festers. A man like Sawney Bean, angry and cruel, still exists. Maybe he's not in a cave anymore. Maybe he's on a forgotten farm, in an abandoned warehouse, behind the locked doors of a home where no one knocks. Because that's what the Beans remind us of, that horror doesn't always announce itself with thunder or flame. Sometimes it creeps slowly, silently, through places we don't bother to look. The legend endures because it speaks not only of what humans are capable of doing, but of what they're capable of ignoring. It's not just a story about what was done. It's about what wasn't done. For 25 years, no one looked close enough. No one wanted to. The story ends where all stories like this eventually do in silence. The Bean clan is long dead. Their cave, though still a part of the physical landscape, is little more than a battered mouth at the edge of the sea. No gravestones mark their names. No family trees bear their record. The line was deliberately and violently ended, extinguished root and branch. But what remains is not the family. It's the fear, the moral weight. The unresolved question that pulses beneath every version of the tale. How did this happen for so long? Because the story of Sawney Bean is not just a tale of horror, it is a mirror. It forces us to look at the fault lines in our own world, the places where systems fail, where cruelty thrives in isolation, where community ends and indifference begins. It's easy to dismiss the Beans as freaks or monsters. Easier still to imagine their lair as a singular place in a time now lost. But to do so would be a lie. What they became is just one extreme end of a human spectrum. Given enough isolation, enough hatred, enough neglect, something like them could happen again, somewhere else, in some other form. And maybe it already has. For the people of Galloway, that fear became generational. Even now, more than 500 years later, the coast still feels haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory. The land remembers, even if the history books resist. Walk near Benane Head, and you'll feel it, the shift in the air, the way the waves strike differently, the way the crows behave as you get too close. You'll sense a story beneath your feet, pressed into the earth like a bruise, and if you dare to stand at the edge of that collapsed cave and listen, you may hear nothing at all. Or worse, you might hear something that sounds like movement low, wet, rhythm echoing from the stone. It's probably just the sea, but then again, it always was. There is no comfort at the end of this story, no redemption, no lessons wrapped in optimism. The Beans left behind no survivors, no apologies, no explanations. Their violence wasn't the consequence of war or famine or vengeance. It was their culture. It was their routine. And the worst part is that the world outside let it happen. They killed with impunity because no one thought to search. They were invisible because the system had no reason to see people like them poor, hidden, expendable. And so, long after their deaths, they still teach us something we'd rather forget. That horror doesn't always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it looks like your neighbor. Sometimes it hides in the hills just outside town. Sometimes it raises its children in silence and teaches them to be hungry. And sometimes, when it is finally uncovered, it is too large, too old, too deeply rooted to ever really be destroyed. We live in a world where it is still possible for entire communities to vanish, where people disappear and no one is held accountable, where systems of justice look the other way because the victims were the wrong kind of people, too poor, too far away, too alone. And that's what makes the Bean story more than just a grisly footnote of Scottish legend. It is a warning, not about caves, not about cannibals, but about what we allow to grow in the dark when no one is watching. And if you've made it this far, if the story clung to your bones and followed you through the night, then ask yourself, what else is waiting to be found? What's hiding in your own corner of the world, just beyond the edge of your knowing? And when the scream finally comes from the darkness, will you be the one who hears it, or the one who ignored it?